So welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about something that nobody really ever talks about. It's a very controversial topic, but I don't think that anyone's ever really spoken about one way or the other, and that is, of course, the very quiet debate of comics versus manga. Now, if you couldn't tell, that was a joke, because apparently this is a very highly contested thing, and I want to give my own thoughts on the whole controversial debate, or, what's actually better. So yeah, let's just get right into the video. And specifically, we're talking about Japanese manga versus American comics. Now, the ultimate answer is whichever one is ultimately better for you is the one that is better. And that's not a cop-out answer, that's an objectively true answer, because there is no objective better medium. There's pluses and cons with either comics or manga, and so ultimately it just boils down to whatever you personally identify with, whatever you personally enjoy. Now, for myself, I pretty much equally enjoy both, but for very different reasons. So, with the typical manga, what you're going to find is typically black and white drawings made by the same author. So, pretty much the author, or the mangaka as they're called, pretty much writes all of the dialogue and all of the story, and it's basically all done by one person. So they write everything and draw everything, giving a very cohesive feel to everything that's going on, rather than having different teams doing different things. You're also going to find a pretty self-contained story. So typically, if you want to read all of Monster, or all of My Hero Academia, or all of One Piece, it's all a pretty much self-contained story. Now, of course, there are spin-offs like My Hero Academia Vigilantes, for example, but for the most part, manga is pretty typically all going to be self-contained, all within the same title. Even take Dragon Ball, for instance. There's Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Super, Dragon Ball GT. That's not a manga, but you get what I'm saying. Now, if you wanted to get into the world of Dragon Ball, it's very simple and takes 2 seconds to find out what you need to start reading or what you need to start watching if you want to watch the anime instead. And I'll touch on anime for a second. Basically, anime is just typically a recreation of the manga, just in a video format. So usually animes are one-to-one adaptations, basically showing you the same thing that you're going to see in a manga, but it's typically just a one-to-one adaptation. Sometimes there are instances where the anime might differ from the manga, or, whatever's the case, but usually for the most part, if you've read the manga, you don't need to watch the anime, and vice versa. Now, where I'm getting at with the Dragon Ball example there is that it takes 2 seconds. If you want to get into a world of Dragon Ball, it takes a quick Google search to see what is the reading order for Dragon Ball. You can read Dragon Ball the manga, Dragon Ball Z, and Dragon Ball Super. Pretty cut and dry, and that's the end of the story. But American comics are taking a very clear, different approach, and they have been since the very beginning. So typically with American comics, you're going to find not only a larger format, the actual single issue comic is much larger than a regular manga, single chapter, and so you're going to find a much bigger medium to actually physically read what you're reading. You're also going to find usually color along with different styles of art. Manga typically likes to do, bigger eyes, more cartoony animation to it, or cartoony dynamics to the drawings. Whereas with comics, you're going to find, in typical cases, you're going to find things that are closer to reality, so to speak. So you're going to find smaller eyes, more realistic, facial features, and different dynamics like that. But the big difference with comics is that there is no one straight through line. Well, you could say that there is a straight through line, but that would mean having to go all the way back to the 30s and 40s when all of these characters, most of these characters, were first introduced, at least the big ones in particular. So like for Batman, for example, I can't just hand somebody a Batman book and say, here, go ahead and start reading. Now there's great jumping on points where the Batman mythos has been sort of rebooted, or there's a new status quo where you don't have to read all of the past Batman iterations and the different runs of Batman, but typically, for the most part, it's a little bit harder to just jump into a character. So you kind of have to do a little bit more research and finding out, where you want to jump into, who you want to jump into, and how you want to read them, because there's multiple different Batman books. There's Batman the main series, there's Detective Comics, there's Batman and Robin, there's Batman Superman World's Finest. Those are just some of the main ones that are currently being issued out right now, and for the most part, they're all canon. So it can be a little bit difficult to walk into a comic book store and say, I want to read Batman, because great, which Batman do you want to read? Because different writers are doing the different titles. So one writer is doing the main Batman series, whereas the other writer is doing Batman and Robin or Batman Superman World's Finest. So there's different writers and different stories that are going on. A lot of times these are taking place in different time periods. They're not all happening all at the same time. And sometimes, you could read a Justice League book and then be confused because isn't Batman in this same issue, this same month? Wasn't he just doing something over here in Gotham? How did he get over here in Justice League? And so sometimes things can get pretty confusing. But what I will say to the testament of comics is that there is so much more material. Let's say you're a diehard Batman fan or a diehard Iron Man fan, for example. You have a lot of different material that you can jump to at really any different time period. So you can jump back to the 60s and 70s for Iron Man and Batman and read a completely different character back then. Same backstory, relatively speaking, but it's a completely different written character back then. Whereas if you pick up a modern issue that just came out last month, it's going to be completely different. So you're going to find a different field and a different vibe for whatever you're looking for. So if you really like a particular character, you have a lot of different options. Same with that Batman example. Even in the current day, there's a bunch of different titles, so maybe you're not liking the Batman and Robin series, but you're really liking the early adventures of Batman Superman World's Finest. Now, where there's some pros and cons with both, which I've kind of briefly touched on a little bit earlier, is, with manga, you're going to find a pretty self-contained story. So that is great because if you want to start reading Demon Slayer, for example, you walk into your bookstore or order online or read online Demon Slayer chapter number 1 or volume number 1, which collects a bunch of different chapters. It's very easy to just pick up a first issue or a first chapter or a first volume of whatever manga that you want to read without having to read any of the prior iterations, because there is no prior iterations. If you want to read Demon Slayer, pick up Demon Slayer number 1. There's nothing to read before that. And it's a very simple through line between Demon Slayer 1 and Demon Slayer 23 in terms of the volumes. So that's great for manga, but what I will say is that it is pretty self-contained. So it's great in that you just can jump into whatever story that you want to read, and it's very easy to not have to read all the backstory. There is no other backstory. You just pick up a volume 1 or a chapter 1, you're good to go. But what I will say is that the world building, depending on the manga, can be very limited. So there's great world building where everything feels so self-connected and just, wonderfully intricately designed. Examples would be like My Hero Academia. It's a huge world, tons of different heroes and villains. Everybody has a backstory, and you're kind of, you're easily introduced into it in volume number 1, but then by the end of the series you have experienced the lives of so many other people, and so some manga are very intricately well detailed, whereas others are very isolated and very simplistic in their storytelling, which is great if you just want to read something that is very simple, basic, straightforward. But if you're wanting to really, feel immersed into a world, really feel the world building, it's not often and consistent that you'll find that with manga. A lot of times it's just very straightforward with the story and just giving you a, not in a bad way, but a very cut and dry story. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something to keep in mind if you're somebody that is more in tune with wanting to, see the world and see how other characters are reacting to certain events and, different things that might set up other side stories and things like that. You're not usually going to consistently find that in manga. Now, with comics, the pro is that you can, for the most part, if you know about a lot of the different heroes, if you know their basic backstory, you can walk into any comic book store and pick up any issue and just jump into a story. So like Spider-Man, for example. Everyone knows who Spider-Man is. We all, for the most part, know the backstory. It's not a spoiler to say that Spider-Man is Peter Parker and he was bitten by a radioactive spider and now has powers. Uncle Ben is dead. So, I mean, it's not like a, really big revelation that you have to go back to the very beginning of Spider-Man to really discover who this character is. So, for the most part, like I said, you can walk into a comic book store, pick up Amazing Spider-Man number 58, and just jump into that story because, again, for the most part, Spider-Man's backstory, and a lot of times the different villains that he's facing off against are a lot of older villains that you might already be familiar with. Mysterio, Dr. Octopus, Green Goblin even. So there's a lot of different villains and new ones as well, but if you're not really sure about the backstory of a villain or their motivation for why they're bad, or a hero that is helping Spider-Man, for example, well, you can easily, find the backstory on Wikipedia or a quick Google search, Reddit search, whatever, and you're pretty much caught up to speed. Now, that might contradict the point that I was making earlier about how there is such a massive backstory and numbers and thousands of issues for particular characters, but the point is that getting into comics is only as hard as you make it out to be. So if you just want to jump into a character and just read their newest issue, go ahead and do that. You can easily fill in the blanks later on, figure out why they're in this particular situation. Maybe you're in the middle of a big event. Maybe you're jumping into Secret Wars and you're wondering what the heck is going on? Why are their universes collapsing? And why is Doctor Doom an emperor and all of this stuff? It's very easy to do a Google search or a YouTube search and read and watch videos on the backstory of what's going on in this event or characters or whatever the case may be. But if you're a purist and you want to go back to the origin of a character, you got a lot of reading to do, or at least a lot of recapping to do if you want to go all the way back to what are the start of incursions. There's going to be, incursions aren't a necessarily new thing. I mean, they're not something that just happened in the last 5 years in the world of Marvel. They've been going on for a little while, or at least the setup and things related to it, along with the Illuminati and all of the other tangential things that go along with it. They've all been set up for years and years now. Now, there are some cultural differences too, because in manga and anime, it's, a perfect example is if somebody's like charging up and they're, getting ready to unleash a very powerful attack. It's very common in manga and anime for the protagonist to just let the villain charge up to do their big attack, or maybe they like to announce their attacks before they do them. They have a special name for their attack or whatever. So there's some little cultural nuances that are found in either medium, because manga and anime kind of do that whole announcing attacks thing before they happen, whereas comics is very rare and just kind of nonsensical for like Iron Man to be fighting the Mandarin and let him charge up and do his big move. Iron Man's just going to fly in there and do whatever he needs to do to try to take care of the Mandarin before he can actually do anything. But what I will say to the testament of comics is that what is really helpful are these omnibus, or not even these big omnibus, these big giant hardcovers. There's also trade paperbacks and regular hardcovers that only carry maybe 10 or 12 issues or whatever. But a lot of times there's certain omnibus, and not all omnibus are like this, but there's certain omnibus that are a perfect, just sort of self-contained story. So this Venom story is from the, one of the most recent runs of Venom by Donny Cates, and this basically details the origin of Null. It details, more of a backstory of Clintar, the home of the symbiotes. It gives you a lot more, stuff going on with Carnage and different things going on with Eddie Brock's son. And it introduces Eddie Brock's son all within this omnibus. And basically, by the time you read the beginning of the omnibus all the way to the end, you've gotten multiple big stories and multiple big, ramifications of, different decisions made and different consequences. You've had a whole story, very cohesive story, if it's all written by the same writer. It's great. So there's certain omnibus that are very self-contained like that. But if you wanted to get into, I don't know, Avengers by Busiek Volume 2, it's all of the same, writing from Busiek, but the different stories might not all be interconnected. It's all just going to contain different Avengers stories, and there are sub-stories that are in there that are all connected, but they might not all be as cohesively narrative in the same sense as something more recent like Venom, or even Daredevil by Chip Zdarsky. The first volume of that omnibus is very self-contained. By the beginning of it to the end, it feels like you've really read a very cohesive story, and you want to read the second volume, but if you don't get to it, it kind of ends in a good spot to where you kind of feel fulfilled with the amount of reading and material that you have. So there's certainly cases where comics can be very self-contained, or at least they feel self-contained. You don't really need to read anything before this Venom run. You can just jump into the Venom omnibus and be good to go, as long as you know that Eddie Brock is Venom and that Venom is sort of this alien symbiote that takes over, Venom's body, or works with Eddie Brock rather, and they work together to do things. As long as you know that basic backstory, which again isn't like a spoiler by any means, then you're good to go to read this entire omnibus. So ultimately, is comics better than manga, or is manga better than comics? Again, it boils down to what you want out of your reading material. So if you want something that is consistently more self-contained and you can just walk into a bookstore and pick up the first volume of whatever story you want to read, then manga is the route that you want to go. Comics, on the other hand, is for people that just want to read about a huge interconnected world that has, sprawling stories and, different stories and different writers for different characters. And there's, a whole lot of variety and option in the different characters that you want to read, or the different stories, the different types of stories that you want to read. So there's a whole different, customer base for comics. There's people that can appreciate both. I don't think that one is objectively worse than the other. It's just, again, down to your personal preference. And it might come in seasons. Myself, I go in seasons of reading a bunch of comics and omnibus and trade paperbacks and everything like that, and watching, MCU movies and DC Universe movies. And I just get so like deep into the world of comics and all of the interconnected media and, games like Injustice and stuff like that. I go on a deep binge for a while and I just go deep into that world. But then, a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, I might jump back into the world of manga and anime and be super deeply invested in that. And so it really just kind of comes and goes in seasons. If you're somebody that is a diehard comics fan, you've never cared to experience manga, totally fine. There might be a manga out there for you, but you don't really have to go out of your way if you're enjoying comics and that's been your status quo for a long time. And vice versa for manga. If you're somebody that is, born and raised in the world of manga and that's your only, source of enjoyment in terms of reading material and stuff like that, and you're not, really vibing with American comics, totally fine too. So again, there's pluses and cons and pros and cons to either one, but it ultimately depends on what you want out of your reading material. So hey, thanks for watching. I really appreciate you sticking around to the end. If you could drop a like down below on your way out, and also consider subscribing because we have more conversations like this in future videos. Definitely check out either one of these two playlists on the screen here. I think that you'll find great discussions in this one, but if you're not a big fan of this one, you'll really like this one. So I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.